Okay, 8.3 is the beginning of the evolutionary theory that you could probably trace the idea of evolution way back, maybe even to the time of the Greeks. There were some of those that had ideas that were clearly that God didn't create, but that, they came about by some other means. But back in 8th grade, in your earth science text, it uses this word, uniformitarianism. Inside of that big, long word is the first part of the word, which says what? Uniform. What does it mean to be uniform? What does Megan think uniform means? Logan, what do you think? Okay, could be uniform, could be the dress, and if you're wearing a uniform, everybody's dress is the same, right? So uniform has the idea of being the same. So would somebody want to close those doors so we don't get those on our video? The idea behind this was brought up by two men, one by the name of Hutton and the other one by Lyell. And their idea is that the present is the key to the past. What does that mean? That means if you would look at natural processes at work today, you can then explain, for instance, things like how long ago did something take place, or how long has it been going on. As an example, if we would go, for instance, to the Grand Canyon, and we were to measure how much the Colorado River is eroding the Grand Canyon, in other words, how much per year, and then figure out, okay, now the Grand Canyon is this deep, maybe about a mile deep, then this river must have been running the same way it does right now for this many millions of years to cut this canyon. So that the present is the key to the past. We can figure out how old something is by assuming that whatever the rate of natural processes are today, they've been going on that way for millions of years. Now, what's some problems with that theory? Well, some of the problems with that theory is what we read last week in 2 Peter chapter 3. It says that there are a couple things that they are neglecting. They're purposely forgetting that has happened in Earth's history. One, there were catastrophes. What's the major catastrophe that the Bible talks about?
The flood.
The flood, right. And that flood totally changed the earth. We find no evidence of humans, and whatever they did before the flood, we can't find any evidence of them. God just totally erased it. But they're saying there were no catastrophes like that in the past. The other thing is that they don't recognize the fact that things that look old may not necessarily be old. If God had introduced you to Adam and Eve one day after he had created them, obviously he created you earlier, but had met one day after God had created them, how old would they look? What do you suppose? I mean, what do most people think? Probably like a young adult, right? Maybe might look like in their 20s or something like that. Well, he created them with an appearance of age. When God created plants, like trees, did they sprout from a single seed and grow till finally Adam and Eve could have a grown tree that produced fruit? No, he produced the tree full grown with fruit on it. Had the appearance of age. So people who and this is part of their evolutionary theory, is that things are uniform. There was no catastrophe. God did not create anything with appearance of age. So when I'm looking at something and trying to figure out how old it really is, I'm only trying to figure out what apparent age they have, not what its real age is. Okay, do you understand the difference? When I look at it today, I can only measure how old it appears by today's standards, but they actually had age when God first created them, or the appearance of age. They weren't old necessarily. Now, here's the verses that we talked about last week, but particularly this part here. It escapes their notice that by the word of God, the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. That's creation. They totally ignore that fact, that there was a creation. There's also the other part where, that God overthrew everything on earth by water. He judged by water. So those are the things that, if you could say that the present is the key to the past, you need to include that in there. Otherwise, you're giving ages that don't account for everything. Another guy that added his ideas to the evolutionary theory is Lamarck. And his ideas have to, how do changes come about? Because they, if things have evolved, we need to have changes. How do these changes come about? Well, his theory is the need. For instance, the reason why a giraffe's neck is longer than most animals is that the original giraffe had a normal sized neck. As they ate up the lower vegetation, there was a need to have a longer neck to reach the higher vegetation. So they grew a longer neck. And what goes with that, there's the theory of use and disuse. That he also said that there are things that you use will stay part of you, of your genetic code, and things you don't use will eventually disappear from the genetic code. One of the things that I remember when I was in school, so this would be some of the things that we've learned since then, that one of the things that they talked about were some things that we have in our body that appeared to have no use. And one is our appendix. We no longer need an appendix because we don't have a diet like people who lived like in caveman days. They ate a lot more fruits and nuts and things like that. Their diet was quite different than ours. They needed to have an appendix. I'm not sure what they thought the appendix was back then, but that, since we don't have that diet anymore, we don't need that. Well, we do know that there is a need. I'll cover that in a moment. Now, also the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. The reason why all giraffes today have longer necks is because long-necked giraffes gave birth to long-necked baby giraffes. And that's how now we have all giraffes having long necks. There's a need for long necks. So any characteristic that you would acquire, you could pass that on to your offspring. So if you acquire a trait for, let's say, being really good at basketball, let's just make up something here. Really good at basketball, you can pass that on to your kids, so your kids will also be really good at basketball. Does that really seem to work out that way? It really doesn't. You can have parents that are very good athletes, and they can have children that may not even be interested in athletics. That they don't automatically inherit this. You don't inherit traits that the parents have acquired. Now, so the basic problem here is that you don't pass those things on to future generations. Now, Charles Darwin is probably the one who had some of the biggest influence on the evolutionary theory. The ideas how living organisms have descended. You know, they have offspring, which then in turn have more offspring, and it goes on like that. And you are a descendant of people that lived long ago. So his idea here is if you would take every animal, especially those that they picture as having evolved from each other, or is that if you would trace their ancestors back far enough, you could have a common ancestor with another living thing that might look quite different than you today. Now, one of the things that you sometimes hear people saying that is that man has evolved from monkeys. Have you heard that? People say that? Is that what evolutionists say? Is that what evolutionists actually say? It is not what evolutionists say. So don't, if you say that evolutionists believe that man evolved from monkeys, that's not what they're saying. What they're saying is if you would trace our family tree back far enough, and a monkey's family tree back far enough, we would finally come up with a common ancestor. Like if you would trace your family tree back, you know, here's a similar concept. If you would trace your family tree back far enough, and I would trace my family tree back far enough, we would have a common ancestor. At least if we went back how far? We know for sure if we trace it back how far we had a common ancestor. Noah and his family, right? Now his son's 3 wives, you know, weren't blood relatives of Noah, right? I mean, there's nothing in the Bible that thinks that they married their sisters or anything like that. So, but at least we could trace them all the way back to Noah. We had a common ancestor. Now, we might be surprised that if we traced our family trees back far enough, since many of us are Caucasian, somewhere probably in Europe we had some common ancestor, would be my guess. You know, somewhere in there we probably had a common ancestor, and we didn't have to go all the way back to Noah and Mrs. Noah. Now, one of the things that was really important to Darwin is how to get things to evolve. And part of that was the idea of natural selection. How that organisms that had more desirable traits for those conditions would have the best chance of survival. So we often talk about survival of the fittest. Now, last Thursday and Friday we watched some videos, for those of you that were here, from planet Earth. Did the fittest always survive? No, sometimes they did, right? Just kind of depends on the circumstances that there were. So the fittest don't always survive. But to Darwin, that was a very important thing, so that an evolutionist picture things getting better. As things evolve, things are getting better. That you're much better, the humans that are living today are much better than humans that lived in the past. Which I don't think there's really any evidence that we can have to support that, but that's the idea that things are getting better. Every animal on Earth is now better than any previous form that, previous variety of that animal. Now, what are some of the problems with Darwin's idea that natural selection is kind of what drives evolution? is that natural selection just regroups existing characteristics. Now, let me give you an example of what for a long time was one of their favorite arguments for survival of the fittest and things that drive that. In England, before the Industrial Revolution, if you kind of remember that part of history, before the Industrial Revolution, there was a species of moth called the peppered moth. And the peppered moth was kind of a grayish, mottled grayish color. It had little dark spots on it. And it liked to rest on the side of trees that were growing in the forest in England, and the bark of many of these trees were covered kind of with lichens, that give kind of also a mottled appearance, little dark and light spots. Okay, and when these moths were on that tree, the birds that loved to eat them couldn't see them. But also, some of the peppered moth offspring also had another trait that was black. In other words, there's also some black ones showing up. Now, what do you suppose if a black moth is on the side of a grayish colored tree? They're going to be spotted by their predator and be eaten. Okay? So most of the population was this grayish peppered color. Then came the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was driven by what? The discovery of what actually pushed the Industrial Revolution? Coal, right? Figured out how to use coal, make steam, run engines and stuff like that. Well, when they burned coal, it was very smoky and sooty. And that would make the bark of trees, eventually these grayish trees became black. Their trunks became black. So now which color is favored? The black moths are favored. And the grayish ones that were not favored, were favored before, are now going to be picked off by all the birds that are eating these moths. So what is going to be the predominant color in the population now? Black. Black is not the dominant trait. It just happens to be the one that's most favored under these conditions. So, that looks like evolution has taken place. Well, now anymore, most countries are quite concerned about pollution, and we don't burn a lot of coal. We have other ways of generating our power. And so this soot on these trees has, gone away, and it's gone back to being gray colored. Well, these black moths on a great tree are going to get eaten. But the gray ones, again, are going to be favored. So the population is going to go from being mostly black back to being mostly this peppered color again. So in all of this, what we just had is a regrouping of existing characteristics. Black and gray were already there. It's just that at certain times the conditions favored the gray, and at other times the conditions favored the black. And if neither one's favored, then you probably should see, like what I would call a normal mix of those colors. So in all of that, was there any new genetic material being added? No, it was just taking existing genetic material and just one was favored over another as the conditions changed. So now, Darwin is also, he's the one that wrote The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection. So in other words, he thinks that living things came about through natural selection. As things evolved, certain characteristics were favored, and they were then more fit, and and this organism would slowly change its characteristics to better survive, better fit into their environment. He also wrote The Descent of Man, and it was so some of his books that he wrote actually became the foundation or the reason behind what Hitler believed, that you can improve a species improve a species if you can eliminate all the undesirable characteristics. Makes sense, right? Well, how did Hitler use that idea? He could improve the human species by eliminating what? Who did he eliminate millions of? Jews and gypsies and others that they considered less than desirable. So, and there were others that have, believed in evolution and used that as their reason why what they were doing was right. There's a lot you could read about Hitler and how he's trying to improve the human. And what's I find a bit odd about it is that what he thought was the perfect race of humans was blonde and blue-eyed, and he was neither. But he was helping it to become more, the more desirable trait. We sometimes refer to it as like the Aryan race. One of the important things as far as the evolutionary theory is what we call the geologic column. Now, by the geologic column, we're talking about all the rock layers that are on Earth. And inside these rock layers, we find fossils. And the way these fossils happen to be buried in there, from the deepest, we find the smallest organisms. And as we go up through the rock layers, we find bigger organisms. Maybe start out with bacteria and stuff like that at the bottom. As you go along, you have, maybe fish, and eventually birds and dinosaurs and stuff like that. Okay, now here is a geologic column that if you were going to major in geology, you're going to have to learn. I know we have one of our students who's going to school in Colorado. She wants to be a geologist. She graduated last year, and this is the geologic column that you would have to have memorized. I memorized it when I took many of my geology courses, working for my master's. Not because I believed it, because that's what they wanted those to be the answers. But some of these words you maybe have heard of before. The rock layers that are at the deepest, they think of, the Earth was maybe formed about 5 billion years ago. There it says 4.6 now, that they might be a little older than that, they think. The evolutionists think that. Well, from 4.5 billion years ago up to about 600 million years, we call it the Precambrian age. And the kind of organisms that you find on here would be maybe some aquatic plants and animals that live in water. And we can break this Precambrian up into periods of time that are called Proterozoic and Archaeozoic. Archaeozoic is the oldest. And then after the Precambrian came what's called the Paleozoic, and it's broken up into these periods here. Some of them kind of give you clues as to what maybe the evolutionist says happened during that time. The oldest is the Cambrian, and the last is the Permian. Carboniferous is where the Earth was just covered with many plants, and as they died and were buried by sediment, that's where most of our coal was formed. So we would find them in the geologic column. If we find coal, it's from this period of time right here. Then after the Paleozoic, we have what's called the Mesozoic. And in the Mesozoic, we have some of those terms that you've probably heard of before. We have Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. And during the Jurassic, what kind of animals were all over the earth that you're probably most familiar with? As in Jurassic Park, the movie. Dinosaurs. That was the age of the dinosaurs. See, notice you have dinosaurs right here. So wherever it gets wide, that's what they say, that's when that particular kind of living thing flourished. There was the most of during that period of time. And then the dinosaurs kind of faded out. And this goes all the way up to about 10,000 years ago in their time scale. We are after that, anything that's on there. But modern plants, are flourishing now. Insects are flourishing, maybe not as much as they did back here during the Jurassic period. We found some fossils of butterflies that have wingspans that are about 4 foot. Ooh, big butterflies. Found cockroaches that are about 3 feet, fossil cockroaches that are about 3 feet long. Can you imagine having cockroaches that are 3 feet long? You could ride them. So this is, and then the fish were at their heyday, they said, kind of in this period of time right here. So with that idea in mind, when they go out and look at rock layers and they say they find, let's say, fish fossils, then the rocks are probably in this range here, maybe about 200 to 400 million years old. Now, why such long periods of time? Well, they recognize that evolution, change doesn't happen quickly. We don't see it happening in our lifetime, so it must go really slow. And so these fossils that here represent long periods of time while the change was coming about. Any questions you have? Okay, if not. Now, one of the things that's important to the evolutionary theory is to be able to verify that something is as old as it is. Okay? So, what's interesting is the dates or the ages for the geologic column came about first. They decided that these, how old these needed to be. And then the animals that they found in those different rock layers then had to be that old. The fossils had to be that old. And then, since we've come up with a way to measure the age of something, we think, we can use these dating methods that we've talked about, radioactive dating methods. But they use the principle of uniformitarianism. That is the radioactive material, that's all that was there in the beginning. And then as it decayed, if you remember that decay series that we did last year in physical science, started out with uranium-238 and ended with lead-207, I think it was, that there was no lead at the beginning. So if I measure how much lead there is compared to how much uranium there still is, then that ratio should tell me how old the rock is. And they've come up with different methods for that. We call those radiometric dating methods. But the problem is how can you be sure that there was no lead in the very beginning? You can't. Nobody was there. So you're making an assumption that you have no way of proving. And so to say something is as old as it is, you really don't have any second way to verify that. So the measure of decay of radioactive substances into non-radioactive decay, that lead 207 I think that I talked about, would be you're making this comparison, making these measurements, and then figure out, well, it would have to take this long if the processes happen just the same way they happen today. But remember, they are forgetting that God created everything with the appearance of age. So things are much older than they appear. Another person who added to this is how do you get different species and varieties, and brings up the idea that the only way you can add new information is to have mutations. Okay? So this is used in this case, mutation is the way that we need something more than just natural selection to make new living things or new kinds of living things come about. We need to have mutations, changes in the genetic code. So that leads us to what we call today neo-Darwinism. Neo means what? What's neo mean? It means new. So it's a new version of Darwin today, and it uses two things to drive what they say drives evolution. Okay, Darwin only had natural selection, and scientists just realize that that can't by alone produce anything new. It just reshuffles stuff that already exists. So you have to have a way of bringing out new stuff. And that's where mutation comes into that idea. So it's a blend of Darwin's theory of natural selection and DeVry's theory of mutations. That mutations bring in new information. Now, what do we know about mutations today? Well, we know mutations are random. You can't predict when they'll happen. And the only way that a mutation can be passed on to the generations is for that mutation to happen where? That's one of the questions on the last test, right? What was it? Mutations have to happen to where? In the germ, call it germ mutation. Not somatic mutation. Germ mutation has to happen in the cells that either lead to sex cells, sperm and egg, or the actual sex cells themselves. So they're random, so only mutations that would happen there could possibly be passed on. Mutations, as I said, must occur in the reproductive cells, and evolution requires that there are good mutations. That, remember, I said their thought is that things are evolving to become better and better suited to fit here on Earth, to live here on Earth.